During World War II, Britain wasn't just fighting enemies abroad. It was also confronting shadows from within. Some were British by birth, spoke with a British accent, and were raised under the ideals of democracy, yet they willingly served the very force that was attacking their homeland. They didn't need guns to inflict damage. They used words, ideology, and resentment as their weapons. William Joyce, known as Lord Haw Haw, stunned the country by broadcasting Nazi propaganda from Berlin. Norman Bailey Stewart, a former British officer, leaked sensitive military information, and there were others swept up in a storm of bitterness, disillusionment, or the seductive promises of power. But one name rose above the rest, a name the British public could never forgive, because he wasn't deceived, he wasn't forced. He chose betrayal. His name was John Amery, the son of Leopold Amery, a senior government official, trusted advisor, and a man deeply rooted in British tradition. John had been raised to inherit privilege, responsibility, and public honor. He was expected to become a statesman, a leader, perhaps even a symbol of national pride. Instead, he extended his hand to the enemy. He proposed the formation of a British unit to fight alongside Nazi Germany. He wrote and recorded propaganda that was broadcast to prisoners of war, and he addressed his fellow citizens over the radio, urging them to abandon their country to switch sides in the greatest conflict of the modern world, not for personal gain, not out of fear, but because he believed it was the right thing to do. And that's what makes his story so profoundly disturbing. Born in 1912 in the affluent Chelsea district of London, John Amery was the eldest son of Leopold Amery, a prominent statesman in the British government, a trusted advisor to Winston Churchill, and a man who held high office in multiple cabinets. To many, the Amery name stood for service, loyalty to the crown, and the core values of traditional conservatism. But John was nothing like his father. From an early age, he was known as difficult, defiant, and constantly at odds with his teachers and family. Despite being enrolled in prestigious boarding schools like Harrow institutions, meant to groom the next generation of Britain's elite, John never fit in. One housemaster famously wrote, "He is the most unmanageable boy I have ever encountered." It wasn't that he lacked intelligence. It was that John refused to accept any structure society tried to place around him. He questioned everything. He resisted all forms of authority. And most troubling of all, he felt no shame in doing so. After leaving, Harrow Amery turned to the film industry. He dreamed of becoming a director, a producer, someone who would shape the cinematic landscape. But every project failed. By his early 20s, he was drowning in debt and was forced to declare bankruptcy. In 1936, John married Una Wing, a woman who had previously worked as a sex worker in Paris. His family was outraged. The marriage quickly fell apart, especially as John couldn't afford to support her. He relied on handouts from his parents, while growing increasingly bitter adrift and angry at society, at politics, at religion, and most of all, at Britain itself. And in that personal chaos, something else began to take root, an obsession with anti-communism. John Amery didn't just oppose communism. He despised it. He believed it was the single greatest threat to Europe's survival. To him, Western democracies were blind to the danger, and only regimes with strong centralized control, like fascist Italy or Nazi Germany, had the strength to preserve order. This wasn't a passing phase. It became a kind of faith. And as the world inched closer to war, John Amery didn't see fascism as a menace. He saw it as an escape. To most, this was the beginning of radicalization. But for Amery, it felt like the first time in his life he had anything worth believing in. In 1936, after a string of personal and professional failures, John Amery left Britain. Officially, he moved to France to start over. But in truth, he was searching for something deeper, a place where he no longer felt like a misfit judged by his past or crushed by expectations he couldn't meet. In Paris, Amery began mingling with far-right intellectuals and political circles groups that championed nationalism, condemned communism, and admired the authoritarian order of Mussolini and Hitler. Among them, he was no longer seen as a failure. To these people, he was a courageous Englishman willing to admit what they believed, that Britain had lost its way. He attended closed meetings, formed ties with pro-German factions in the French fascist movement, and became captivated by the promise of a new Europe, one no longer divided by weak democracies, but united through power and control. Then came Spain. When the Spanish Civil War erupted, Amery claimed he had joined Franco's nationalist forces, supported by Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. Though the extent of his involvement remains unclear, Amery insisted he worked in military intelligence and even received a Medal of Honor from the Franco regime. To him, it was the first step in his personal crusade to save Europe from communism. To everyone else, it was something far simpler. John Amery had crossed the line. After the war, he returned to France with a hardened belief that democracy was doomed. In 1940, when German forces invaded and occupied Paris, most British nationals fled. Amery stayed. He didn't hide. He didn't run. He approached the occupying German authorities directly. And there, in the heart of Nazi-occupied Paris, he did something no British citizen had dared to do. He voluntarily offered to collaborate with the Nazi regime. His proposal was bold and precise: to form a military unit made up of British citizens who would fight against communism alongside German forces. For the Nazi propaganda machine, Amery was a rare find. At first there was hesitation, but the more they listened, the clearer it became. Amery wasn't an opportunist. He genuinely believed in the cause. By late 1942, after months of lobbying and negotiation, he was granted special travel clearance to leave occupied France and relocate to Berlin. There he was, given housing, financial support, and something far more dangerous, official permission to build the unit he had envisioned. From that moment on, John Amery belonged to the enemy, and there would be no coming back. Berlin winter of 1942. John Amery arrived in the capital of the Third Reich with a plan so bold and so bizarre that even hardened Nazi officials paused to listen. In a formal meeting with German propaganda authorities, Amery proposed the creation of an armed unit of British volunteers who would fight alongside the German army on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union. He called it the Legion of St. George, a name designed to sound noble, patriotic, and distinctly British. This wasn't betrayal. He argued this was saving Britain from communism. The Germans were intrigued but skeptical. They had heard many foreign sympathizers talk, but rarely had they encountered a Brit who so completely believed in their ideology. Amery wasn't hedging his bets or angling for favor. He meant every word. He wasn't just offering to help. He was offering himself. After months of negotiations, the Germans approved the plan as a pilot program. The first step: recruitment. Not from civilians, but from captured British soldiers, Amery was granted access to several POW camps under German control. He moved from one to the next, identifying himself as a reawakened Englishman, delivering speeches, handing out leaflets, and urging prisoners to join a new cause. The leaflets read, "Fight for a free Europe against the Red Menace." Amery promised them freedom, dignity, and a chance to fight for something larger than national allegiance, an ideological war to save civilization from the East. But the response was silence, or worse, laughter. Most prisoners rejected him outright. Some listened only to get extra rations. A few agreed out of fear, despair, or pure exhaustion. At its peak, the unit never grew beyond 27 members. Eventually, it was rebranded the British Free Corps, now under the notorious Waffen-SS. But it was never a true military force. It existed more on paper than in battle. Meanwhile, Amery continued his propaganda work. From Berlin, he recorded English-language broadcasts calling for revolt among British troops and urging Britain to sign peace with Germany in order to unite against the Soviet Union. But no one was listening. The British government denounced him. The public dismissed him. His voice, once filled with grand purpose, was met only with silence and contempt. To the Nazis, Amery's value faded. He was no longer a believer. They had plenty of those. He became a symbol, then a footnote, then a burden. To Britain he had become something worse. He was a man who chose to betray his country loudly, proudly, and without regret. His dream became a mockery. His so-called legion was treated as a joke. The Germans used him, the British erased him, and history branded him the first openly declared traitor of the 20th century. Yet even as the war turned, as Berlin trembled under Allied bombs, John Amery kept writing. He kept speaking. He kept pleading for a world that no longer wanted to hear him. As if to the very end he still believed he was right. By 1944, the Third Reich was beginning to collapse. One Allied victory followed another. Cities that once stood firm under Nazi rule fell, one by one. Berlin was no longer a haven for dreamers of propaganda. It had become a shell of itself, and those who were once praised for their ideological loyalty were now quietly discarded. John Amery was no exception. The British Free Corps never became a real fighting unit. The Germans soon realized that Amery offered no real military value. His radio broadcasts, once a centerpiece of their English-language propaganda, were shortened, then discontinued entirely. The man who once believed he would lead a British crusade against communism was now a forgotten figure in a city falling to pieces. He left Germany, not to flee justice and not in fear. Perhaps he was simply searching for another place that still believed in what even Berlin had stopped pretending to support. In April 1945, in the final chaotic weeks of the war, Amery and his companion Michel Thomas were apprehended by Italian partisans near the town of Como in northern Italy. He did not resist. He did not make excuses. He said nothing. A makeshift trial and immediate execution were considered. But instead, John Amery was handed over to the Allies. Within days, he was brought to Milan, where British troops confirmed his identity. The voice that once called for revolt over German airwaves. The face once printed on treason notices now sat quietly before them, tired, unshaven, and hollow-eyed. There were no speeches, no flags, no cause left to carry. He was placed on a military transport back to Britain. No press, no crowds, just a sealed file with one label: treason suspect, British national immediate transfer required. When the plane landed in London, the war in Europe was nearing its end. The streets were preparing for peace. Nations were preparing for rebuilding. But for John Amery, the most decisive chapter had yet to begin. He was returning to a country that no longer recognized him as its own. Not to speak in his defense, but to stand and listen while the nation he once abandoned delivered its judgment. July 1945. John Amery entered a courtroom unlike any other he had known. There were no speeches to deliver, no microphones waiting. This wasn't a platform for ideology. It was a place where the country he had turned against would now render its judgment. At Bow Street Magistrates' Court, he was formally charged with 8 counts of high treason, each tied to his work with the enemy during wartime. There were no flashing cameras, no shouting headlines, no lawyers arguing strategy. Amery didn't challenge a single word. He pleaded guilty without hesitation. A few days later, he was transferred to the Central Criminal Court, Old Bailey, where Britain had tried its most serious criminals. Some believed he looked hollow, already resigned. Others said he seemed calm, even composed. But when asked to respond to the charges, Amery answered with one word: guilty. The trial lasted just 8 minutes. There were no witnesses, no cross-examinations, no legal drama. Just a man standing alone before the law, accepting everything laid before him. Justice Humphreys, presiding, looked directly at Amery as he passed judgment. He reminded him that friends and family had tried to stop him, that he had been warned again and again. Yet he had chosen to ignore them. "You were not misled," the judge said. "You were not coerced. You acted of your own free will, and in doing so you have forfeited your right to live." No one in the courtroom questioned the outcome. No one spoke in his defense. There were no outbursts, no final words. In the weeks that followed, a few attempted to petition for clemency. Some claimed he was mentally unstable. Others argued that he had accepted Spanish citizenship and couldn't legally betray Britain. All appeals were dismissed. Even claims that he was dying of tuberculosis were disproven after a medical examination. Nothing stood in the way of the sentence. In the days leading to his execution, Amery was held in solitary confinement at Wandsworth Prison. He didn't write appeals. He didn't ask for mercy. He read quietly and smoked 15 cigarettes a day. His full allowance. Prison guards described him as courteous, calm, and eerily composed. He wasn't angry. He wasn't afraid. He didn't act like a traitor or like a man condemned to die. He was simply John Amery. In November, just weeks before Christmas, the date was set. The man who would carry out the execution was Albert Pierrepoint, Britain's most experienced executioner. Years later, when asked about Amery, Pierrepoint replied with only one sentence: "He was the bravest man I ever hanged." No more broadcasts, no more slogans, no more causes to serve, only silence and time running out. On the morning of December 19, 1945, the corridors of Wandsworth Prison were silent. Outside London was cold and grey. Inside, the steps of the guards echoed softly as they approached the cell of the man whose fate had already been sealed. John Amery didn't speak when they opened the door. He calmly stood, brushed off his sleeves, and followed them without a word. He didn't ask for a priest. He didn't ask for time. He asked only for a cigarette. He smoked it slowly as they led him to the execution chamber, a small, soundless room that had seen many final moments. Standing at the gallows was Albert Pierrepoint, the man who had overseen more executions than anyone else in British history. Amery looked him in the eye. "I've always wanted to meet you, Mr. Pierrepoint," he said with a faint smile, "though perhaps not under these circumstances." Pierrepoint nodded. Then quietly, professionally, he took Amery by the shoulders, turned him around, and began the process. The guards secured his arms behind his back. A hood was placed over his head. The noose was adjusted with precision, measured in advance to the last inch for his weight and height. There were no delays, no ceremony, no drama, just one final step. Pierrepoint pulled the lever. The trapdoor opened. John Amery dropped into silence. It was over in an instant. His body fell with perfect timing, the drop calibrated to break the neck cleanly. There was no struggle, no sound. There was only stillness, and the end of a man who had once believed he was right up to the moment the floor gave way. John Amery was 33 years old, the son of a senior British statesman. A man who had spoken with conviction, acted with purpose, and followed that purpose straight to his death. He died not as a soldier, but as a traitor. Not in battle, but in a prison chamber surrounded by the country he had turned against. And yet even his executioner would later say it. He died with more dignity than most. There were no flowers sent. No headlines mourned him. His body was buried in an unmarked grave within the prison walls, as if the country he betrayed wanted to forget him entirely. But history didn't forget, and neither did the questions he left behind. Questions about loyalty, belief, and what happens when someone gives everything to the wrong cause.